It's the 10th anniversary of the Still Loading podcast, and it is brought to you by the wonderful people over on Patreon. Amazing people like Charles M., Stephen P., Mr. Biscuits, Gilmer, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, and Eric H. have been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode, along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, after 10 years, you'd think this damn thing would be loaded by now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval. Today's episode is the 10th anniversary of the Still Loading podcast. Can you believe it? 10 years ago, July 7th, 2014. It's actually kind of perfect that this episode is also coming out on July 7th, exactly 10 years later. I did not plan that. It just kind of worked out. Now, for those who may be asking, Josh, when I look in your podcast feed, there's no episode 1. It goes back to episode 7. Well, that's because the first 6 episodes were uploaded to SoundCloud back in the day, and I that was when I was still figuring out the ropes, and I didn't quite understand how to put podcasts onto Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts back when that was still a thing. I didn't know how it worked. I had no idea how to distribute it, and it took me a little bit to figure out that you have to put the RSS feed and give it to Apple, and they have to vet it and all that other shenanigans. So figured all that out, and that's why episode 7 is the start of this feed. Now, when you are hearing this, you will actually be able to listen to those first 6 episodes. I have re-downloaded them all from SoundCloud, or I found my original files from 10 years ago, and they should be on this feed now. As of today, they should be up on this feed right now, which is kind of awesome. That's right. So they are out for you to listen to. Warning, once again, really rusty, really rough around the edges. I didn't really know what I was doing 10 years ago. But here I am now celebrating 10 years of the podcast, and I wanted to start off our 10th anniversary with talking about how the show got started. I figured this is as good of a time as any. I don't really bring it up on the show here about like why I started the podcast. I do it on other podcasts. I'll talk about how the show got started, but I've never really gone into detail. I mean, maybe I did on the 200th episode. I don't really remember anymore, but 10 years is a big deal, so here we are. I figured I'll at least repeat the story because it's probably been a good while since I've told it on this show here. So back in 2014, let's go back a little bit further. Back in 2013, I got started at my job that I currently work at, and I had a lot of, not downtime. The work was busy, but it was a lot of busy work, so I could listen to music. And after listening to basically the same songs over and over and over again, I kind of got tired of listening to music. And at that time, I didn't even have a smartphone, so I couldn't even play music from my phone. I had an MP3 player. I had a Panasonic MP3 player, not even like an iPod. And it was a little 2 gigabyte thing that could store just enough of maybe it was more than 2 gigs, but I could store like a handful of albums on it. I think they said it was like 500 songs or some shit like that. So I forget exactly the amount, but I would use that a whole bunch. And I got tired of that. And then I eventually did get a smartphone. My first smartphone was a Windows phone, like a Windows operating system phone. And I remember finding the Windows podcast app, and I thought that was really cool. And the first podcast I saw on it was Jay and Silent Bob Get Old. And now, if anyone has listened to that show, you will know Still Loading is extremely far from it. Not only in terms of the topics, but also just in terms of like, I love Kevin Smith and I love Jason Mewes, but that show is raunchy as hell. Like really graphic sex stories and stuff like that. Like Jason Mewes tells some pretty raunchy stories from his past, which are funny, but it was a culture shock to me when I first listened to that. And I remember like listening to it and be like, people can just talk about this online? Like, what the fuck? Like, what is this? But through that, I ended up discovering Kevin Smith's other podcasts, Smodcast, Hollywood Babylon, and eventually Edumacation, which grew to be one of my favorites, even though I think that's behind a paywall now, Edumacation is. Anyway, fell in love with it. So then I started searching for other things. I remember typing in the word retro just because I was into like retro things, like retro geek culture, I should say, cartoons from the 80s and 90s. I was just into retro in general. And then the first thing that popped up was Retronauts, podcast I shout out frequently, still shout out all the time. And I got hooked on their shows, and they were talking about classic gaming. And at that time, I did have like a passing interest in classic gaming and retro games. I was a fan of the Angry Video Game Nerd, and he kind of got me into collecting a little bit. But in 2013, I was only like kind of like collecting was more of a on and off type of thing. I never really I wasn't a serious collector. That's the phrase. That's what I'm trying to say. I never seriously tried to get into collecting then. And then once I started listening to Retronauts, I really got hooked on retro gaming content in general. So I started watching more retro gaming stuff on YouTube and getting into retroware and stuff like that back when that was a thing in 2013. And I really just fell in love with listening to podcasts. And I remember editing podcasts in college, but it was my college stuff. So at the time I was like, why would anyone listen to just people talking? And then I ended up being one of those people who just listens to other people talk. And it was just fascinating. I loved it. I loved the Kevin Smith stuff. I loved Retronauts. And when I heard Kevin Smith, he had a speech. Whenever he would do his Q&As, he's long-winded like me, so I can relate. But he has, whenever he does Q&As, he always has a tendency to go on like a bit of a speech, not just finish telling the story, but like someone will ask one question and it'll go in like a 20-minute explanation, and he'll just tangent and all that other stuff. So one of his tangents went into how your voice is is your own currency. It is something that you own that you can trade in, and like no one else can produce more of that currency except for you. Your voice is like your only currency in this life, as what he described. And he talked about how everyone has their own unique voice, and how everyone has like a story to tell, and everyone's creative in some way, shape, or form, and you might not realize it. You just haven't found what you're creative at, type of thing. And so he had a whole thing about encouraging people to start a podcast because you don't know what may come from it. He specifically cites his friend Brian Johnson from the Tell 'em Steve Dave podcast, how he was, this is a bit of a content warning right for just this second right here. He was considering suicide, and starting a podcast, starting Tell 'em Steve Dave, helped bring him back from the edge because it gave him something like an outlet. And when people started responding to it, not necessarily like his darker thoughts, but just like to him and his opinions, and people thought he was funny and clever and this and that, it helped him a lot. Now, I wasn't going through any of those mental health struggles, but that did speak to me a little bit, where it was like, well, this seems like fun, like not necessarily the darker side of it, but just friends shooting the shit. And I'm like, well, what would I want to do a podcast about? And I had also been getting into like the extra credit stuff. I think it was on The Escapist when that was still a viable website. And they were like analyzing games in a way that I had never heard before, analyzing games as an art. And I kind of wanted to do something like that as a podcast, and a combination of Retronauts and extra credits and stuff like that. And that's kind of like how I determined I would want to do the podcast and what I would want to do it on. It was retro gaming, but with a little bit more of like an emotional bent to it. Retronauts was a lot more like, here's information, here's some quick memories, and we'll get in and out. I love Retronauts. I still listen to it, but it is a different vibe. And so I love the idea of like really diving into the nitty gritty of a game, or the best I can at least, and analyzing it. And that's how I kind of started the show. And so I asked my good friend Justin, who is the original co-host of the show, and he said, yeah, I'm definitely in. And we were trying to do it weekly for a while, and it was difficult, man. I mean, back then it was really hard to do remote. So luckily we lived like 15 minutes apart from each other, maybe 20. And so we could do a podcast every single week. And even then, though, it was still hard to do. Like, we do like a couple weeks in a row, and then we would stop because it was hard to schedule, or we couldn't come up with topics. And then we would do another couple weeks in a row, and then same thing. And eventually Justin, his life just got too busy. He moved farther away. It would have been taking him like 40 minutes just to come over and record like an hour or so podcast. Now, granted, we were in our early 20s, so we had a little bit more free time. Neither of us were in long-term relationships at the time. So it all kind of worked out for us. Like, we could handle that, but it was still really difficult. So that's why if you go back and you listen to my earliest episodes, Justin disappears, and I keep mentioning, oh, he'll be back. And then I eventually just stopped mentioning it because I started doing everything solo. And then I started figuring out the voice and what I want to do for the show. And it's funny thinking it back for this episode, for this 10th anniversary, and kind of rehashing all this. It got me thinking about how, like, you know, my current, like the current iteration, like what I've been doing on the podcast now, I realized I think I always wanted to do this, but I didn't have the voice for it and didn't understand how to do it when I first started. Like that critical analysis of games and like really finding an emotional bend to my critiques. You know, the episodes that I'm most proud of are the ones where I'm able to really dig into my emotions of a specific game. You know, think of the Bluey episodes, think of the episode on Celeste, like where I'm really like diving in deep. I think I always wanted to do that, and I just didn't know how. And especially the earliest episodes, one of the things that I'm not going to delete them, but I'm not necessarily proud of, it's when you're trying to figure out your own opinion and figure out how to speak your own opinion and thoughts on anything. It doesn't even have to just be games. You a lot of times will be repeating other people's opinions and not necessarily taking them as your own, but using them as kind of like, I thought this argument was interesting, so I'm going to repeat it because I want other people to know about it. And a lot of my early episodes, I took a lot of my points and thoughts from like extra credits. Like there was an early episode on video game music, and I don't think that episode, I haven't gone back to listen to it, so maybe it's not bad. But from what I remember when I recorded it, I took a lot of the points that I was making from the extra credits video. And I remember giving them credit. Hopefully I gave them credit. If I didn't, that was a bad thing. But I don't think that's necessarily good. It's okay to be inspired by other people's opinions, but you should really try to pick a topic and come to your own conclusions first. But I don't think I had the vocabulary or the skill set to do that 10 years ago. So while I'm not necessarily proud of how I handled those episodes, I am proud of the fact that I use those as a stepping stone to what you hear now. Like I've grown throughout the show. And then also when Justin left and I had to do all the episodes solo, and that's why a lot of like the early episodes, they're like 30, 40 minutes and I'm rambling and I'm not necessarily making the best points, but it was teaching me how to podcast. Like I will always, it was called the 40 for 40 series, is this era of the show that I'm talking about where I had 40 complete in the box NES games and I was reviewing all of them. And they're not great. Like there's a lot of stuff I could do better. I've redone, I think one of them I redid Donkey Kong Classics with my friend Dearest Abby. Shout out Dearest Abby. She's awesome. She was a great guest for that episode, but it took a while for me to even get to that. And those episodes are just rough because I was still figuring out how to podcast. And I'll never delete them, but it is very much me learning how to articulate my thoughts and figuring out my voice and figuring out how I want the show to be, or what I want the show to be, and how I want to present myself on the show. So it took a long while. I forget who I was talking to, but if I think about it, the show really didn't come into its own until like 2020. So it took me 6 years to really figure out what I wanted to do with this podcast. And I'm grateful that I stuck with it, because now it's one of my favorite things that I do, just period. I was not expecting this intro to go this long. I was just going to do a quick story of like, hey, here's how the podcast started. Here's what I got into. Justin joined me and he was awesome. And then, blah, blah, blah. And Justin and I are still friends. You're going to hear him a little bit later on in this episode. But anyway, so that's the story of the podcast. I got into podcasts through Kevin Smith and Retronauts, decided to start my own, wanted to try to find a happy medium between the comedy of Kevin Smith, maybe a little less raunchy, but the comedy of Kevin Smith with the information of Retronauts. I don't think I quite nailed that mixture. I've figured out my own type of voice for it, and that's great, but that was what I was originally trying to do at first. I mentioned the 40 for 40 series. That was like my learning how to podcast, and then 2020 rolls around, and as awful as that year was, because it was the start of the pandemic, it was really the moment my podcast came to be what it is now, that was like its first steps into what it is right now. So it's been 10 years. It's been 10 years of podcasting, and I gotta be honest, y'all, I don't feel this slowing down. Like, I love doing this so much. And the growth this show has had has been so encouraging over the last 4 years. Like, I used to have, at the beginning of 2020, I would say I averaged about maybe 20 downloads an episode. Not even, maybe like 10 to 15. And I have grown to more than 5 times that. Like, that it is... I'm just so blown away by the support I've been given, and I can't thank you all enough for that support over the last 10 years. And the show's not going anywhere. Like, part of me wonders, like, does someone see 10 years on a show and be like, oh, wow, they've been at it this long. Should I even bother listening? Hopefully not. Hopefully people just see, they see a plethora of episodes and pick a topic they like and dive in, but who knows? But I love doing it, and I can't thank you all enough for your support. It really means the world to me. I wouldn't have the drive to continue. I love doing it, but your support and feedback, whether it's just seeing the download numbers go up, or whether it's seeing messages, or whether it's messages that I get from other podcasting friends or from strangers or from the reviews, it's all very encouraging and it's all very much appreciated. So sincerely, thank you. Thank you for keeping me going for 10 years. Another group of people I want to thank, though, are my amazing guests. This show really would not be what it is without them as well. The two halves of this equation: the audience, all you wonderful people who support me, and the wonderful guests and collaborators who help me kind of find the voice of the show and who have helped me find the voice of the show over the last 10 years. I actually was mid-recording and I decided to stop just to see how many unique guests I've had on the show in the last 10 years. And admittedly, a large chunk of them have come within the last 4. I counted 151 unique guests. There have been over 150 people on the show. Give or take a few, I might have missed some, but I think if I got everyone, there's over 150 people who have helped make this show, who have been a part of this. And I want to put a spotlight on the wonderful guests, but I obviously can't do that for all 150 people. So I've picked 10 guests. These are people who are either real life friends who have been with me since the beginning, or friends of the show friends that I've made through the podcast that have really been supportive in terms of being a sounding board and listening to my shenanigans and dealing with any types of anxiety that I might get after recording. I might ask them, like, oh crap, did that sound awful? And I'll send them clips and they'll give me their feedback and stuff like that. So these are just 10 of the many guests. I don't want any of my guests who are not on this 10 to feel left out. You all mean a lot to me, like sincerely. Like I said before, I couldn't make this show without you. But these are just 10 of the guests who have really helped me find my own voice over these last 10 years. And that is what I want to do here. I have 10 mini interviews with 10 different guests for 10 years of Still Loading, just for you to get to know a little bit more about them. Like, you only hear a small snippet of them on the show, but I wanted you as a listener to find out more about, what types of podcasts do they listen to? How did they get into podcasting? Or if they're not a podcaster, what art form are they involved with, and how did they kind of get into it? What are their influences? And just to get to know a bit more about each of my guests here creatively. So here are 10 wonderful people who have helped make the show what it is. I'm going to throw it over. I don't know the order in which this is going to be just yet, but at the very least, you know what? We are going to kick it off here with my co-host, with the Mo-host, Dexter Morrill, and then you'll hear 9 other interviews after that. So let's start off with our first interview here. Let's get it started. No 10th anniversary would be complete without my co-host with the Mo-host. Joining me now, my good friend Dexter Morrill. Dex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I feel like I need like a little yay, like a little audience cheering.
Oh, shucks. It's been
Stop
10 years,
sit
man.
down, you.
Well, it's been 10 years, and I was telling you literally just seconds ago off mic before we hit record that you've been a part of the show for on a monthly basis for I think 3 years now. At the very least 2. It's
There's no
definitely
way I
getting
would have
close
come
to
up with that
3.
number. If you had
What,
asked
sorry?
me, I would have been like, if you had asked me, there's no way I would have come up with it. I would have been like,
Dude,
like a
you know
year
what?
and a
I'm
half.
thinking about it. It is 3. And you know how I know that? Is because my daughter was born in 2021, and I asked you to do the Captain N stuff because I needed some way of having consistent content that was not hard to, I didn't have to do a lot of prep. I didn't have to do a lot of research. It was just something fun. And you signed on for that. And we've been doing it once a month now since the spring or summer of 2021. So it's been 3 years.
Wow, that is
That's
wild.
bonkers. But yeah, as I've been doing for all my guests here, I asked my other guests, my other podcasters, how did you first get into podcasts? But since you, sir, are an illustrator and an artist, I wanted to ask you when did you first start noticing art, when you start being able to appreciate it? You know what I mean? Because I feel like whenever someone gets into a medium, they first have to appreciate that medium first. So do you remember when you first started noticing what you liked about animation and art and illustration and stuff like that? Do you remember when you first started kind of coming cognizant of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that I don't know about anything specific, but I definitely was more in tune with animation. I distinctly remember having conversations with my family being like, if it's got real people, I don't want to watch it. Like movies and TV shows and stuff. But yeah, I've always been drawing, and to get where I am now, um, for any artist, it's great to have a support system. And, my parents were always very supportive of my art endeavors. And something that I didn't know until I was older, that they told me that they had like their first parent teacher meeting for when I was in kindergarten. And one of the
Hmm.
things that my teacher brought up to them was like, hey, keep an eye on his artistic ability. He's the only kid in class that's like drawing fingers on his people and like putting clothes on his people.
Oh, that's so cool.
So like, most people at 4 years old or so, or, they're drawing
Well, if
stick
it's
men. And
kindergarten, it'd be 6, but go on.
yeah, well, I started younger.
Okay, Mr. Smarty Pants.
I was 4 going on 5, but um, I probably would have been 5 at the time of the parent teacher conference kind of thing. But yeah, they were they had mentioned that to my parents, and from my perspective, I just noticed that I was getting different crafting kind of gifts for birthdays and Christmas. I loved it all, like special markers or stencils or spirograph or all kinds of just different doohickeys that would be like Etch a Sketch and like all different kinds of creative outlets.
Hmm.
And I loved all of that stuff, and I ate it up. um and the second formative thing for me with that was, I think I was in second or third grade. We had moved. I was in a different school,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a kid in my class who was better at drawing trees than me. Like he was good at drawing different things than I was. And I remember the other kids in the class being like, "Oh, this kid, he's so good at drawing." And I remember just feeling like this immense amount of like competitive jealousy, like no, I'm the art kid, like, and that just inspired me to work even harder because I definitely rested on my laurels in the sense that, like most good parents, when you bring home a drawing or something, like your parents are like, "Oh, it's great, it's amazing, it's the best thing I've ever seen," and I was content with that at that age. But then all of a sudden seeing someone else getting praise from my peers, I was like, no, I must be the champion. And that was like the extra boost I think that I needed. um I have no idea where that kid is now. Like, and I don't think that they knew that they had that effect on me. But
Yeah,
um, it was something that I think that just cemented my goals of being an artistic person, was like how much that meant to me, of being known as being an artistic person, not just doing the art, but like the stuff that went with it, of like people wanting to depend on me for artistic things,
yeah.
and kind of like being known for it. So, but yeah, as a kid, I used to try to copy comic books. I used to try to draw the cartoon characters on cereal boxes, like the the Sugar Smacks frog and like Tony the Tiger. And
Mm-hmm.
um, I definitely have distinct memories of trying to draw Fred Flintstone from my Flintstones Nintendo game cover. And like, so it was just something I always um, loved to do. And I just never stopped.
That's really cool, man. I love hearing that story. That's awesome. That's so cool. I can kind of relate a little bit with like um not for myself personally, but just being young and remembering kids who are good at drawing. This isn't exactly a one-to-one. There was a girl, and I remember it was like in second grade. It was like the first girl I ever had like a little like kid crush on. Um I don't even know if I remember her name anymore. I think it might have been Jessica, but she did coloring better than anyone I had ever seen at that, when you're like in kindergarten. Like it was one of those ones. I even remember the way she colored, right, where it was like she, like if you had like like a little kid drawing, that you're supposed to color in, like that you would see in like Sunday school or something like that, right?
Yeah.
um she would do a hard color for whatever color she was coloring with. Say it was like a red shirt, she would do a hard line around the border of it and then do a lighter color of it in the center. And I had never seen anyone do like different textures like that.
That's
And I went,
cool.
whoa. And I don't know, that you just unlocked a memory for me. I know that's not perfectly related to what you're talking about, but it got me thinking. uh I wanted to now ask you though about, continuing on with talking about your art. What would you say is one of the biggest influences to your art? Like what is something that like kind of helped you find your own art style? Because as I've asked the podcasters, as the analog for this question is like, what helped them find their own unique voice for their show?
Right.
For your art, like what helped you kind of figure out your own style over the years?
Oh man. So I would say like the biggest influences on me were definitely the Ninja Turtles. I was the prime age
Mm-hmm.
when the whole Ninja Turtle craze happened. And I just loved those characters, those designs, the action figures, like that whole thing, that whole media blitz, the Nintendo games.
Mm-hmm.
Which leads me into like, honestly, that's why doing the Captain N show was so perfect, is like video games in general were an enormous influence on me. And it's still like to this day, when I remember dates and times and stuff, it's usually centered around video games. Like when was that? Okay, I remember going to this kid's house and playing that game, so it had to have been 1991. Like I remember things through video games. I the and like I said, going back to Captain N, like that fascinated me, that there are these pixels on the screen, and some of them are just a limited amount of pixels, but here they are fully animated in these. Now we laugh at them at how different they look now compared to how they're rendered for everything else. Everything's got to be on model and everything, but from like how King Koopa looks compared to how Bowser looked in the Mario movie, like it's completely different. But all they had to really go off of were some sketches and pixels on a screen, and that kind of distance between the two, like, where it had to be filled in so much by creative interpretation. And I loved that gap between what the limited pixels could do and versus what an artist could do. So I always loved that imagination side of things, and all the way up until my master's thesis, because I went to college and I got a very traditional art bachelor's degree, which was drawing, painting, sculpting, ceramics, woodworking, photography, like all of your basic art trades.
Yeah.
But I wanted to go back to school because of my passion for animation and the more digital modern art kinds of things. So when I went back to school for my master's degree, part of the master's degree was having to write a thesis. Like I had to do research. I had to pick something to research on, research on. And that was when the kind of famous now Frank Cifaldi at GDC, Game Developers Conference, happened on emulation.
Why you need to steal from your companies and whatnot, I think is
I'm trying to
what he
remember
called it. Or something like that.
It was something about emulation was the name of his. I wish I could remember what it was.
Yeah.
Or it was something like "There's nothing wrong with emulation" or something like that. And he dropped a stat that has always stuck with me. How he said that the first 50 years of film as an art form, like movies as an art form, out of the first 50 years of its existence, 80% of it is lost to time.
Yeah.
That there was just like nobody took it seriously as an art form for a long time. And then even when they did, there was no consistent preservation techniques. And so the caveat off of that stat was, hey, guess what? We're 50 years into video game history, and we are about to repeat what film went through if we don't jump on this now. And I answered the call. I was like, yes, I must do something about this. And like I said, it was perfect timing. It was when I needed to decide a topic for my thesis. And so I jumped on that and wanted to help out in the way that I could, which was just through my art. So I ended up doing my thesis on game preservation through storytelling in comics and what that could do. And it led me down this road of how many comics were in video games, in like the instruction manuals and comics about video games. And, it led me to actually meeting with Retronauts East. I don't know if he's been on in a while, but Chris Sims is a comic book writer, and was part of the kind of Eastern branch of Retronauts. And I had a couple great conversations with him, and he had written the Sword Quest comic, which it was really interesting, and it had this interesting perspective of, it wasn't about the game, like being in the game world, because there were actual Sword Quest comics during that whole Atari Sword Quest stuff.
Yeah.
But this one was about people who played Sword Quest, and it kind of had this interesting lean to it about game preservation and how games affect people. And I definitely recommend people check it out if you haven't. But Like all of these things kind of happened at once, and it was really eye-opening to me when I decided that for my thesis, how much of an influence video games have had on my creativity as an artist. So really, really long-winded way of saying like video games probably have had the biggest influence on me.
On like finding the voice for your art type of thing, finding your own
Yeah.
style, I should say.
Yeah. The way that I tell stories, the way that kind of come up with character designs and all of that, the old Zelda manuals, the old Mario stuff. Bubble Bobble had a Comic Zone on Sega Genesis. That was, I used to love the manuals as much as the games, remembering how much those things had an impact on me and eating up the cartoons, Captain N, Mega Man, Mario Super Show, Zelda, all of those things.
That's awesome. I like, man, you just took me down like a nostalgia rabbit hole. Not even my own. I just like I loved hearing all of that. Um, and you mentioned something when you were talking there about that Sword Quest comic. I actually have that run. I think I do. I think I have all of it. The print run of that Sword Quest comic from Chris Sims. I never finished reading it though. I have it, but I have yet to actually. I actually read like the first two issues and really, really, really enjoyed it. But I never set aside time to read comics, and I definitely should do that more. But Dex, the last thing I want to ask you before we kind of sign off here is, what do you have planned going forward? Like what are some of the projects that I know we have something kind of in the works that we've been thinking about for a while. So aside from that, is there anything that you got going on that like you kind of want to tell my listeners about as like a look to the future? Like what do you have? What are you working on?
Yeah, well, I will start out by saying that I expected that I would be like the next Jack Kirby. Like that was always my plan to be the next. You know, this guy doesn't do anything but crank out comic books. Like that was what I expected for myself. And it wasn't until I went back to school that I realized, and being married to a fellow art instructor, that I realized that teaching I'm extremely passionate about now. I never thought that that would be something I would end up doing, but teaching art and kind of helping other up and coming artists maybe get some of the support that they normally wouldn't, or give them the kind of some of the knowledge that I wish that I had had at their age. So that takes up a lot of my time these days, is doing that teaching and helping these young artists reach their full potential. But as far as on my side stuff, the thing that actually connected us to begin with was doing a kid's book about video game history, the Miyamoto book, and I would say that my New Year's resolution that I made to nobody but myself, and I told my wife about it, was I think I just want to flat out print that book, because I did finish it and I ran a Kickstarter for it, but I had very lofty goals of making it like this really really prestigious like board book, which
Mm-hmm.
if you have a kid, those board books are the real thick like board pages. Those are much more expensive than just making a traditional book, but I think I might go that route, make a traditional book out of it, get it printed, start selling it, and move on from there, because um, I feel like there is a void out there for uh, video game history for kids. um, Both of us have little ones at home, and I wasn't eager to put a controller in my son's hand. Like I am excited for the time when he does start playing more and more video games, because of how important they were to me and impactful they were to me. But I also want him to enjoy playing outside and getting dirty and things like that first, before I introduce him to that stuff. So um, and he devours books. He loves books.
Mm-hmm.
He's already reading and everything. So he loves books, and I felt like um, that would be the best way to kind of get him interested in games and getting him passing on that video game knowledge.
Yeah.
I think I remember listening to Pat on the CU podcast, talking with Ian, and they were talking about how everybody, like, there's so many people that just have a bunch of Elvis memorabilia that has just plummeted in value, because nobody cares about Elvis anymore. All the people who did are dying out, passing on, and so now the next generation either doesn't know who Elvis Presley is or just doesn't care. That knowledge and passion wasn't really passed on. It was just kind of held on to by the people who enjoyed it, and then it's kind of dying with them. And he talked about the importance of, if you want things to continue, if you want things to pass on, you have to introduce that passion, keep that history alive in the continuing generations, the future generations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's super important. And there seems to be this void. There's plenty of video game history books, but I feel like there aren't enough geared towards younger kids, and that's a void I would like to start filling.
I mean, I that's like you said at the beginning, that's why I had you on, because I thought that was such a unique and interesting angle to approach game history, like to make it for kids. And I share the same sentiment as you and Pat. Like if like, especially from a collector standpoint, not that I ever plan on selling any of my stuff, but like, if you want your stuff to retain value, not that that should be the most important thing, but like, if you want it to mean something, like to screw value, if you want this art form to mean anything, if you want the history of the art form to be appreciated, you have to pass that on. Um, Kind of similarly how like there's film buffs who, they're younger people who will go back and watch movies that happened, that came out before their time, and they can find different ways to appreciate it. You want to encourage that same sense of passion and excitement in younger people for games too, and I think that's a good way to do it with that idea that you said there, like that board book, that video game history book for kids. But Dex, thank you once again for joining me, man. This was awesome having you on for the 10th anniversary episode. Before I let you go, where can the good people find you online?
You can find me online: Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram. That's usually where I'm posting or sharing things, whether it's artwork or video game history, those kinds of things. I should be sharing some stuff from my students here pretty soon, but you can find me on there. Just search my name, DexTermorrill. You'll find me on there. But I want to say congratulations on the anniversary. And thank you for having me on all this time. It's been awesome, making such a good friend. We do, keep in touch outside of recording, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Congratulations.
Thank you, man. Thank you. And thank you for being such an integral part of the show for the last 3 and going on longer. 3 years so far, and 3 and counting. That's the better way to put it. 3 years and counting. So thank you, Dex.
Absolutely.
All right. And joining me now is my good friend Eric Guest from the Unlockables podcast. Eric, how are you doing today?
Josh, I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me on. I really, really appreciate it. And let me be the first to say happy 10th anniversary. I'm honored to be able to celebrate such an incredible milestone with you.
Dude, thank you so much. I can't believe I've been doing this show for 10 years. It's surreal. I've told other people like people have asked like how long you've been doing it. I'm like, and I'll say 10. They get surprised. I'm like, yeah, but I really only got good about in 2020. it took like 6 years to figure out the footing of this show. But yeah, man, thank you for coming on. My first question to you is, how did you first get into podcasts in general? What was the first podcast you remember listening to, or what was some of the first couple podcasts you ever like tried out?
I mean, I think I'd always heard about podcasts, kind of ever since like the advent of smartphones and iTunes and stuff like that. And I kind of always regarded them as like, oh, it's just internet radio. It's just shows that people can put out. That's like almost like a morning radio station show, that type of thing we kind of have. But I didn't really seriously get interested in them until I started working up in Chicago. I was commuting to Chicago to work by car, which led to some really, really brutally long commute times, as one could imagine. And so as I was continually cycling through all the music that I normally listen to, I was just like, I need something else to listen to. And at the time I was really into video games and really into sports. So I started just dabbling with some sports podcasts, with some video game podcasts. Some of the earliest ones I can remember listening to were the Rooster Teeth podcast, rest in peace, as they're now gone. Before they kind of had like the downfall of where they ended up before they shut down. I remember I listened just to some like generic shows from like IGN and Game Informer, just because I wanted to like know what was going on in the video game industry. And then on the sports side, just kind of whatever sports podcasts are popular. I'm sure ESPN had a couple. I listened to Bill Simmons, who's a sports guy out of Boston. I really liked the shows that he did and the way he talked about sports and stuff. So that kind of initially just started my interest in it. And then, I had tried the whole like YouTube thing to make like YouTube content when I was in college and make like video game videos and stuff. But I just found it like frustrating and overwhelming. And video didn't really click with me. And so when I discovered podcasts, I was like, oh, it'd be really cool. I had the itch to like make some kind of content. And so I wanted to make content around video games or sports. And one of my good friends at the time, we were really into basketball. We were watching like every game. We were texting about like all the games and everything that was going around the NBA and stuff. So the first podcast I really started was an NBA podcast that lasted maybe like 7 episodes.
Do you remember what it was called? Or do you not want people to know about it and find it?
I think it's gone because I think I removed it. I believe it was called the 3-Pointer Podcast. And that was just me and my friend Jeremy. And we just kind of went over games and talked about like basketball topics and stuff like that. I was a little bit more into it back then than I was and than I am now because time is limited. And then once that kind of went away, I was really like, I kind of got into Twitch streaming for a while, and I tried to be a streamer for about like 4 to 5 months until one month I almost used all the internet data allotted for my parents' house, and they told me that I was streaming so much that I like the Comcast called us and was like, I've used like almost like several terabytes of data, and we're going to start throttling your internet. My mom's like, what are you doing up here? And I'm like, oh, I'm just streaming, whatever.
What were you streaming in? Because were you streaming in 4K or something?
No. So I was just streaming in the standard, I think 1080, but we were in a community that supported as a bunch of streamers that like supported one another. So if at times I wasn't streaming, I would be like watching other people's streams and like supporting them and networking. So the combination of like watching other people's streams a lot and streaming my own just kind of ate up all the data. So and I was doing it like a lot. I have like 4 or 5 tabs open at once, so that's probably what did it.
I was like, I'm just trying to wrap my head around the fact of using that much data. I watch YouTube videos and Twitch a lot too. I don't think I've ever gotten a call from Comcast being like, you're using too much internet. But if you're doing that for like months on end, multiple tabs and streaming, I could maybe see it. But that's just wild.
Yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot. And so I was like, all right, that's clearly not for me, at least not until I move out of my parents' house. So I wanted to try that again. I've done a couple streams here and there. I never really went back to it hardcore, but I kept coming back to podcasts, and I was like, well, that's just audio. And that's just me talking into a microphone, editing the audio, and then putting it out there. So I learned how to do that. I learned how to work with audio. I learned all about podcasts, RSS feeds, all that kind of stuff. And I did my second podcast, which was called Blame It on the Lag, with a couple buddies that I met streaming. One was my good friend Tom, who then we would go on to do Side Questing podcast, which was my third one.
Okay, and that's where we met at Side Questing.
Yes, and then Tom and I just got really busy. Our schedules never really aligned, and I just decided that I wanted to start working on something. I wanted to keep working on something, and that's when I came up with the idea for the Unlockables, and that's kind of where we are now. I kind of started off interviewing other people that made podcasts and made video game content in the space. You were on the show pretty early on in the show's conception. I think you're like episode 5 or 6,
something like that, yeah.
Which is wild to think about. And then kind of as my life got busier and my wife got pregnant and I had a kid, I switched to doing more like solo content on myself, by myself, stuff that was more focused on certain topics, stuff that was more highly produced, kind of written, more planned out. And that's kind of what I've been doing ever since.
I'm trying to look up now real quick, like how long ago our first episode was. Just like how, because I was thinking about this, man. I've been thinking about like, it's just surreal to me that I've known some of my podcasting friends longer than a lot of like than people I work with at my real job. Like what I'm trying to see. Okay, so I was episode 8. That was back. Oh, it'll be 2 years ago very soon on April 13th, which by the time this episode comes out will have already passed. But that's how far in advance I'm recording this, y'all.
Yes.
So that's just, and we knew each other prior to that as well, like because it was in side questing. That's just crazy to think. For your show Unlockable, since that's the one that has stuck around, and you're kind of using that as like your branding to branch out into YouTube and all this other stuff, what's been the biggest factor in helping you find your show's unique voice? Like, how did you kind of discover what you I mean, I guess all of us are technically always figuring out our voices and like where we want to go with it, but for where you're at right now, what has been one of the biggest factors in helping you find the voice of your show?
Well, I think early on what I did to meet a lot of you guys is I really forced myself outside of my comfort zone, because I'm an introvert at heart. I can only take so much social interaction before I just kind of shut down and my batteries or need to be recharged. But when I started the podcast, since this was my 4th podcast and like 6th or 7th time attempting to do some kind of content based project, I knew very well that people don't really just like show up and listen to something that's like brand new unless it like breaks into virality or you get a really lucky break. So I was like, I'm going to start posting my episodes on Instagram. I'm just going to start following a bunch of people that it recommends to me that are in the podcast space. And then I'll listen to their shows, and then I'll just message them and be like, hey, I really liked your show, and to see if I could strike up some kind of like networking or relationship with those people. And Keith from the Main Quest podcast was one of the first people that messaged me back, and he was like, I listened to your show, I really liked it. And then Keith kind of introduced me to this bigger burgeoning podcast circle that we've kind of formed that includes like Chris from Retro Hangover,
who's also
Dave,
one of the people on this episode.
Love you, Chris. Dave Jackson from Tales from the Backlog, Rick Pixel Project Radio. Too many people to mention, otherwise I'd be here for a while. But just a really great community of people that really kind of inspired me. And the one thing I noticed was, and this, I'm not trying to like knock anybody's shows or anything, but a lot of people's shows are predicated on playing a game, people coming on and talking about that game, which I've done several times here and on several times other shows.
I feel attacked, but go on.
No, but all you guys do a really fantastic job of that.
I guess I did take it personally.
Yeah,
I was just joking.
you got to bust my balls on the 10th anniversary show. So I mean,
it's my show, goddammit.
Exactly. So I marveled and noticed like how well people did that, and I realized pretty early on that kind of format really wouldn't work for me on like a time basis, or like I really had a desire to do something different. Not that I'm like blazing a trail here by doing something different, but I thought about a lot in those early days of Unlockables, like what video games kind of meant to me. And that's kind of when the Kingdom Hearts idea started to form. And I really wanted to talk about the personal connection of games to my life and tell the story of video games, because I have this view of video games that kind of like goes back to like the origin of human existence, where humans have always told each other stories, whether it's like medieval bards traveling from town to town, or books or movies or TV shows. And now video games came along as another vehicle of that medium of storytelling that humans have always done. And I wanted to really focus on telling the stories of these games in a different manner that focused on a little bit of their development and a little bit of their the connection they made with me, because I truly believe at the end of the day, that video games are an art form, and art forms connect with people differently depending on just who you are as a person. And I think there is no one right way to analytically analyze a video game, because it connects with everybody so differently. And I really wanted to kind of hammer on that point and just share my connections with the games I've played. And so the Kingdom Hearts Guiding Keys idea really kind of spawned from that thought process of, this is a game that has meant so much to my life. It's been a story that's been with me longer than almost anything I've devoted my life to ever. I mean, it's going on almost 20 years. I've devoted more of my life to Kingdom Hearts than I did getting an education and going to school, which is insane to think about at this point. But and I also, the secondary purpose of that was to kind of squash the taboo that Kingdom Hearts is this gigantic, unapproachable monolith of a series that is too confusing for anyone to enjoy. I know I've kind of rambled on there, but
no, you don't have to apologize.
Unlockables really came from this desire to. It's in my tagline. It's the story of video games, the people who play them, and the memories made along the way. And those are kind of like my three guiding stars. And everything that I write and do, I kind of always think about that mantra as the guiding force in the content that I create and I put out.
I think one of the things I enjoy about your show, man, is you're able to find the emotional core of the games that you talk about. I understand part of that is because you have an emotional connection. You might not be able to necessarily do that for every single game unless it made you feel something. Some games aren't going to do that. But what I like about your show is, for the games you do cover, whether it's trying out Ocarina for the first time, you find some emotional connection to make. And I like how you are able to speak about it, like to put words to feelings. So sometimes I have a hard time with that. Like sometimes I will, I like when I do an episode about something that's super meaningful, I actually have to talk to a bunch of people who aren't in the podcasting sphere just to get my thoughts out. So that way I can form my opinion a little bit. Not saying you don't do that, but I even with all that, I don't think I can do as good of a job as you do at being able to describe the emotions in a way that is both understandable and relatable. So I really enjoy that aspect of your show, and at the risk of being super cheesy, it unlocks the emotional core of those games, which I love.
I like it. That's good.
Last question I have for you before I send you off is plans for the future. Anything that you want to shout out of your show going forward? Any plans that you want to let my audience know about? And then, of course, after that, where can the good people find you online and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, as of this recording, I've begun my playthrough of Kingdom Hearts 3, and we are very, very close to the end of Guiding Keys, which is kind of crazy to think about, because that was a journey I started almost 2 years ago. And I'm getting a little choked up just thinking about it. But by the time this episode releases, that may very well have been wrapped up, or we may be right at that we might be coming to the conclusion of that series, which I think will be a really, not that it'll be a big deal for the show, but just for me personally, that'll be a really big deal. For those of you that have listened and know, like you said, my emotions are very heavily connected to that game. And now that my first child was just born and I'm playing the series that I say basically had the biggest influence on my life of anything I've ever consumed, I'm sure that I'm going to be a wreck when I have to wrap that up. So that'll be wrapped up. I don't have any concrete plans after that. As I was telling you off air, I do want to figure out what my next mini series is going to be, because I really like having that mini series within my podcast that is kind of a thread that runs through, a continuous story thread that runs through, and then I kind of do smaller episodes around it. I've really enjoyed that, because it allows me to get really, really specific about the series of games I'm playing, or whatever my topic is. And then I can just do like little one-offs here and there about stuff I'm thinking about as I'm playing games around that big project. So I don't know what that's going to be. I have some ideas. I think I would like to get away from Square Enix and Tetsuya Nomura for a little while, because he's had a
What are you
stranglehold.
talking about?
Yeah, he's had a stranglehold on my life for the last like 2 to 3 years. So I just think getting to something that's maybe a little more sane would be good for me. But I will figure that out hopefully within the next couple of months as Guiding Keys starts to wind down. And I really want to keep doing the YouTube stuff. Like you said, I released my very, very first YouTube video on Ocarina of Time, my first playthrough. And that was an incredible learning experience, just to try out a different medium and expand my skill set, and to finally play Ocarina. You know, it's the video game that everyone says is so fantastic, and I finally got to play it. And I think I want to keep making videos with that kind of same aim as my show, to kind of drill down to the emotional core and really dissect what I think is fantastic about those games. So I have a couple more videos planned. I definitely know I want to do one on Kingdom Hearts 3, because that is a future, I guess, spoilers for Guiding Keys. That is a game that I have some conflicted feelings about. And there's some other games this year that I want to play and get some videos out, and that'll just be whenever I have time to do that. So I don't want to stop making content. I think there's going to definitely be more episodes. And my goal this year too is to figure out a way to reincorporate that collaboration spirit, because since my wife got pregnant, since my kid was born, I haven't had the chance to have people on my show. I've really kind of taken the solo podcasting thing to heart and just been like a solo podcaster. So I definitely want to find a way to reincorporate that spirit of collaboration with my own unique Unlockables twist. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, I have all my socials in a convenient space. You can just go to linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast, and our Discord server's there. Although I will admit my Discord server is more dead than a lot of the people's in the community. But if you want to hear me ranting about Nomura on any given time or day, that'd be the place to do it. And all my Twitter, my Instagram, all that kind of stuff, where I post any of my designs or just fun, wacky stuff I do. Like I do Fun Fact Friday. I've started that back up, where I just like make a graphic about a wacky video game fact and post it out there, and just do kind of random stuff like that. So linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast. And if you want more, I have several episodes that I've done on the Still Loading podcast with Josh. Not that I'm his best guest he's ever had, but I really did enjoy my time with those episodes. I know there's one on Birth by Sleep that's one of my favorites that I've done with you, just because that always gets a little crazy. And then last month we did Mario Kart Super Circuit, which is a super underrated Mario Kart game. That was a fun one with Dave from Member 64. And there's some other ones in the pipeline. So
a year ago before that, you were also on Super Mario Galaxy with my friend Chris, the British Bond addict.
Yes, yeah. That was another.
That was a good one too.
Yes,
but yeah, Eric, thank you once again for joining me, and thanks for stopping by.
Josh, thank you so much, man. And again, congrats on 10 years. Looking forward to the next 10.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Joining me now, my first podcast partner in crime, I should say, first or second. I'm not sure. Erica may be my first podcast partner in crime. Either way, you know what? I'm going to say you're the first podcast partner in crime, because you're the first person I met online and became friends with through the podcast. Joining me now, my good friend TJ Teej himself, TJ Hodder from The Hodder Show and Tapes of Trepidation. TJ, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, buddy. It's really good to see you. Congratulations on 10 years, man. It's mind-boggling to think that you and I have now been buddies for, I want to say, I mean,
it's close to 10 years. I think we met in 2016. I
thought it was 2017.
You know what?
Because it was 2 guys in a. You know what? It doesn't really. You know what? Look it up. I'm curious because
I'll look it up. I think we did this the other time too on I think one of our annual episodes type of thing. I'll see if I can find it. But yeah, no, it's wild, man. Like we've known each other for quite some time. And I just realized I did not do the entire, like he came down from the great white north and bestowed upon
Yeah,
us two
no.
moose antlers.
That's reserved for our once a year podcast
Yeah,
together.
I guess so. And you're right, 2017, November 20th, 2017. So it is like 7 years ago now.
I mean,
which
it's
is,
been pretty close to 8 years, because it was technically Two Guys in a Game was our link up, right?
Yep.
It wasn't with the Harder show. So that's why I was like, man, was it?
Yeah,
I can't
no, it
believe
was
I can't believe I did another podcast like just over a year into my podcasting journey. That's insane. But anyway, that's
it's neither here nor there. But
Yes.
TJ, we're going to kick this off with the question I've been asking all my podcasting pals. I don't know which order any of this is going to go into, so this is going to be all kinds of like incongruous compared to what's going on. But the question I have for you first: how did you first get into podcasts? Not podcasting, but just listening to podcasts and discovering them for the first time. What was like? How did you first kind of get into that?
Ooh, let me think about that for a second. So, my podcasting journey, as far as a listener, started technically with a wrestling podcast called The Art of Wrestling by Colt Cabana. I don't even know how I discovered it, but I started listening to it, and that led me to other wrestling podcasts. Talk is Jericho, the Russ Report ? The Steve Austin Show specifically, which was like one of the first ones, and then that led me to finding other music podcasts and things like that. But I didn't really fall in love with podcasts as far as a listener until I used to work in a music store. Music store closed. I had a weird relationship with music for a couple of years, so I didn't want to like listen to music a lot. It was kind of this weird thing.
Okay.
And during that time, I just listened to a ton of podcasts because like I spent a lot of time alone. My wife was working shift work and I was working during the day, so I'd be at home a lot. And I was like, man, this is boring. I need like some company. So the Joshta Show, Talk is Jericho were probably the two biggest ones for me. And then from there, it just became this big motley crew of podcasts that I listen to now. And I got into the horror stuff and audio dramas and all that fun stuff.
Do you still listen to any wrestling shows, or is it mostly just the horror drama stuff?
I do listen to Talk is Jericho on occasion. Mostly the only one I really listen to a lot it's called Something to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard and Conrad Thompson. It is just they cover like a different either pay-per-view or a decade or person every single week and stuff like that. It's a really great podcast. The person, Bruce Pritchard's his name, he is like one of the big behind the scenes guys for WWE, and he has been for decades. So kind of a fun thing. But yeah, Something to Wrestle and then Talk is Jericho, probably really the only ones I still listen to regularly. Maybe throw a couple in there once in a while, but mostly those.
Okay, all right. And then in turn, what made you want to start your own show? I mean, you and I have both been, I think, out of all the people I'm interviewing for this 10th anniversary, I think you, Chris from Retro Hangover, and while it hasn't been quite as consistent, Erica from Apex and the Abyss and now Monster Madness have been doing it the longest. So what got you into, or what made you want to start your own podcast all those many years ago at this point?
Real quick shouts to Erica. Monster Madness is awesome. And obviously I loved Apex and the Abyss. As far as starting the Hodder Show, I mentioned previously the music store. When I was there, what I loved most about that job was kind of talking to these different musicians and figuring out what kind of players they are and kind of what makes them tick. So I could help them, with music gear and things of that nature. But then it's also to get to know these people, especially the younger players. I just really love talking with them about that kind of stuff. And there was a couple of times where people were like, dude, it's almost like you're interviewing us. Like, I feel like you're interviewing me. Like, and my boss at the time was like, yeah, like you should do like videos for the store where you're interviewing people. And I was like, no, that's kind of interesting. I actually just realized, I don't know if I've ever actually talked about this on my show ever, but that was something that was talked about at one point that just triggered my memory for some reason.
Did it ever actually come to fruition?
It
The
did
videos?
not, unfortunately, because I hate I hate video editing. So it just wasn't a thing, and I just didn't have time. And I was the only employee for a while, so like I was like, I don't have time for this shit. But it was always something in the back of my head. I love to talk, as if people have heard me on the show before, they know I ramble, as I'm doing now. So that was in the back of my head. A friend of mine was doing, actually, funny enough, a wrestling channel, like a YouTube channel, and then some game streaming. And I wasn't involved with it just because at the time I was so busy with the store. But he was like, dude, I'd love to get you involved with this wrestling thing. So one night I was going to go over and record. My creativity was firing on all cylinders that night, and unfortunately he had to cancel, as things happen in life.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, man, I'm so creative tonight. I just want to do something. And I was just sitting there and I was like, man, this podcast thing. I love these podcasts. And I'd have people say, oh, you should do a podcast. You talk so much. You always have good stories. Like, it'd be interesting. So I was like, man, if I had a podcast, I could call it a Hodcast. I left the silence there for a ridiculous laugh because it's the stupidest thing ever.
It's so, I wouldn't be honest, man. That's so dumb. It's funny.
Yeah. And I went and recorded my pilot episode, which is still up to this day. I refuse to pull it down because even though it's the cringiest shit you've ever heard.
Episode? No, that didn't work.
The HOD. I don't know. We're thinking too much into this. But yeah. And then from there, it just grew into me started off just with friends, then musicians I knew. And now since then, I've branched out to people from all over the world, musicians, authors, other content creators. You know, I did other podcasts, like obviously Two Guys in a Game I mentioned earlier, gaming podcast, which is how you and I met. And now I'm doing a horror narration podcast because why not?
That's wild, man. I still can't believe like it. Just how like it's weird how some of these things start. That's why I'm always curious how everyone kind of got into their own show. Now with the Hodder Show, and I mean you can also answer for tapes of trepidation as well.
I know it's a bit of a mouthful.
What was the biggest factor in helping you find your show's unique voice? You know, every that can take a while for some people. Some podcasts come out fully formed, and others it can take a little bit of time. For me, I put myself into the latter. It took me a long time to figure out what the kind of like voice for my show is, as it were. So what was the biggest factor for you helping you find the voice of both the Hodder Show and then in turn Tapes of Trepidation?
So for the Hodder Show, I would say I was about, really, if I'm being honest with myself, about 100 episodes in, when I would still do these weird one-off episodes where it was like, just like weird, almost like blog type stuff. And I still do stuff like that once in a while, but it'll be a lot more focused.
Mm-hmm.
Right after the 100 episode mark was when I really started to do interviews and really focus on that. That was really my bread and butter. And my friend came on as a producer around that time too. In that 100 to 200 episodes, well, 100 to 150 span especially, you can really hear how I start to find myself in the show, and having him coming in to help with production really just brought everything together, and he was able to kind of focus me a bit in certain aspects. So that was something that really was a big factor for me. Just putting in time, man, just putting in reps. As you know, the more you do things, hopefully the better you get at it.
Absolutely. Hopefully.
You know, I mean, I think sometimes I still suck at interviewing, but every once in a while somebody will be like, dude, like, that was really fun. You're really good at this. I'm like, okay, cool. Thank you. So for the Hodder Show, that's really what it is, and what it was just reps, you know, that's the number one thing. And for Tapes, even though it's still relatively a new show at this point, as we're recording this, that had been something in the making for pretty much about 4 years. I have always, well, I shouldn't say always, but even, you know what, even back in like 2016, I had like an episode of the Hodder Show around Christmas time, because I love telling ghost stories at Christmas. It's just something I've always loved, ever since I was a kid. I had like an episode about like Christmas creatures or some shit. So I've always kind of flirted with horror narration. I've always loved it. And it wasn't until 2020 that I really fully discovered the world of horror audio drama and horror narration and stuff like that. But in the years leading up to 2022 was really the year that I did like a Halloween special for the Harder Show where I narrated stuff. I did a Christmas special. I did like my own unique horror stories and stuff like that around that time. So really over the last 2 years, I've just kind of put reps in on the Harder Show, and then Tapes of Trepidation started as a show on the Harder Show's Patreon account. So I was able to kind of work out the kinks on Patreon because a lot of the patrons for the Harder Show were fans of horror as well. So it was something that I always wanted to do. I never thought I had the skill for it. A couple of people really kind of pushed me in that direction to be like, dude, like, no, you've got something here, like, explore it. And I was able to kind of get past that awkwardness of figuring out what Tapes of Trepidation is. And then when I launched, I really was able to just kind of hone in on it. And even as the show's progressing, I'm still kind of figuring things out. It's like I said, it's still relatively a new show. We're under, 30 episodes at this point. So it's like, I'm still very much figuring things out, but it's something that I love. I wish I would have started doing it sooner. That's my only regret about it, but it's so much fun. I love doing it. It is a really, truly a passion project. And hopefully with more reps, I'll just keep getting better is the hope. Same with the Harder Show.
I think the reps thing is like super underrated for a lot of people because like some shows, like I said, they come out fully formed and it just really feels like the person, whoever's hosting it, just gets it right from the bat. Not everyone is that lucky. And I'm not saying that the person, I'm not saying that the person who got it right away was just all luck. Obviously, there's a lot of skill and like natural talent involved with that. But like it's one of those things where it's like, at least for you and I, we both needed to put our reps in. Like it's funny you mentioned episode 100. That's kind of when I felt my show started to take form in some way, shape, or form. And it wasn't really until the year 2020 that I really started figuring out what I wanted to do with the format of Still Loading. And so it's something I always like to talk about, like when people ask, and it doesn't happen often, I don't get asked this too often, but every once in a while I get asked by people like, what would you recommend for a new podcaster? And the first thing obviously is don't expect to be famous with it, because it like my show has finally started gaining some traction and it took a fucking decade to do. So don't expect that. Also, or first off, don't expect that. Second, don't be afraid to let your first couple episodes be bad. I was talking about this on an episode on a guest spot I did over at Pixel Project Radio. I mean, the time we're recording this, it came out just this week, I want to say, but the time this episode comes out, it was a few months ago. And it was just talking about how, you kind of have to put, like every time you die in the game Celeste, it's almost like a badge of honor. Every failure is almost like, look how much harder you worked. And I kind of view it similarly with the podcast, where it's like, I look at an episode I did maybe at the start, and I'm like, wow, that was really bad. But you know what? That just means I get a second opportunity to do it right. I get to take this game that I really like and really give it an earnest second shot and have it live up to par with something that would be up to my standards currently. Like I kind of look at it that way. So that those reps, man, I think that's a really underrepresented part of podcasting, because so many people now think, okay, you need video production. And don't get me wrong, if you want to be popular, get video production. It'll make it significantly easier. But if you don't have the means to do that, if you're not some Richie Rich who can spend money on an editor, or if you just use AI to do it, which I don't recommend, but it's out there. Like if you don't have those extra means to it, then don't worry so much about it. Just keep putting in the reps. You're eventually going to get good enough. And you just never know. So I don't know. I really enjoyed hearing how you found your voice, because it's very similar to my own story. So I feel, I mean, obviously we're friends, but I feel even closer to you now. We kind of had a similar journey going through that.
I think the two, just to quickly say something, I think the two most important pieces of advice, and I feel like you're going to agree fully with me when I say this, from two people who have been doing it for a while, is quite simply put in reps and have fun. The whole point of getting into any creative outlet, first and foremost, should be because it's fun. And if you start doing it and you're a month in and you're like, this isn't fun, this is not for you, and that's okay. Go do something else.
You
That's
tried
fun.
something.
That's awesome.
That's the important thing. You tried it.
Mm-hmm. But
whether it's podcasting or any other creative endeavor.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter what it is. If you want to do a creative endeavor, make sure it's something you really want. Record a few episodes ahead of time. But at the end of the day, do this because it's fun.
Exactly.
That's why I'm still doing it. That's one reason why Josh is still doing it, I'm sure, too. It's fun, and that's what we all should focus on. Let's have fun.
And it's funny, we're running close on time, we're running short on time, but I want to tell this quick story from a different podcast I listened to. It's a bigger, much bigger podcast. It's not really, it's indie technically because it's not signed with like some studio, but it's huge. Tell 'em Steve Dave, which is one of it's not one of Kevin Smith's podcasts, but it got its launch because of the people who host it are Kevin Smith's friends, but they've kind of turned it into their own thing, which is just crazy to see. They had a guest on, Ming Chen, who was on the show Comic Book Men, and he now runs like a podcast recording studio in New Jersey. I think it's called like Otherworld. I forget what it is. I feel awful that I can't remember the name of it. But you know what? Fuck it. He's not paying me for this spot, so maybe it doesn't matter. But he was talking about how there was a bunch of guys who were like, you know, paying to use the studio and paying Ming to like mix the episodes, and like I don't know if he did editing, but he was just kind of producing it for them, type of thing. And after like doing it for a couple months, they're like, why aren't we famous yet? They asked him straight up, why aren't we famous yet? And Ming's like, I didn't promise you that. I just said I would, like, I can set you up to help you with that, but it's like, if you're not famous, maybe it's on the quality of the content, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's also a lot of fucking luck. What's even more wild is like, when you hear stories like that, you're picturing maybe like an early 20 something, right? Maybe like a teenager, someone who like wants, who sees YouTubers and content creators and wants to do that. No. These dudes were in their 50s. Like, they should really know that life doesn't work that way, that content creation doesn't work that way. But it was one of the wildest stories that I ever heard. I'm like, are you kidding me, dude? Anyway,
I've heard that kind of stuff before too.
It's just nuts.
People have said that to me.
To wrap up your portion here, TJ, plans for the future and plugs. Like, what do you have going? What plans do you have going forward with the Hodder Show that you can share for Tapes of Trepidation, and where can the good people find you?
So easiest thing to do for as far as to find me would be to check me out social media, The Hodder Show, HODDER, The Hodder Show. And I have a link tree in the description of my Facebook and my Instagram, which is the easiest way to get content for The Hodder Show and all that. I'm on every platform you can think of, including YouTube. Same with Tapes of Trepidation. Tapes of Trepidation, all social medias and all podcasting platforms, including YouTube. For The Hodder Show, the only real immediate goal is to continue to have fun. I'm not stressing about things as much anymore. If I don't have an episode out 1 week because I'm just too busy with life, that's okay. But you can guarantee every episode you're going to get from now until episode 500, which is still the big goal. I'm about, as we're recording this, I'm soon to hit 400. So we've got a long way to go yet. But you can rest assured every episode I put out, I'm having fun doing it. I'm loving every second of it. And that's just my goal with The Hodder Show at this point. It's just to keep having fun. Keep having fun, keep growing as a podcaster and as an interview, and try to hopefully keep people entertained As for Tape of Trepidation, it's kind of similar thing. Keep growing, keep having fun. I love this project so much. I can't stress enough how much fun I'm having growing as a producer and a sound designer and a voice actor. As far as anything kind of immediate I can plug for that, as you guys are hearing this, in July or August, I'm planning to do something called the Campfire Sessions, which is going to be myself and possibly a few guests telling, well, some pretty hopefully creepy campfire stories, albeit urban legends or otherwise. So stay tuned for that. If you are a fan of horror and creepy things, check out the show. You might enjoy it. Hopefully you do.
And I don't know, is the episode I did for Tapes already out on the free feed?
It is not, but it will be. And I did forget to mention that at some point, Josh will make an appearance. I don't know when that's going to happen. It might already be out now. So go check it out. If you want to hear Josh read a creepypasta called Mr. Mix, which was a lot of fun. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah, thank you for having me on for that. And yes, everyone, please go check out all of TJ's stuff. I have it in the show notes. TJ, thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much. Congratulations on 10 years, and I'll see you in another 10 for the 20th anniversary.
God. You know what? Fuck it. It's a date.
We'll be in our 40s, bro. It'll be great. Our mid-40s.
Our mid-40s. But all right, man. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, brother. We'll talk to you.
Coming up next, talking all things gaming, all things collecting, with a sprinkle of anime thrown in there, is my good friend Bill from the Gaming and Collecting podcast, from the 3DO Experience, and also the Geek Addicts. All amazing podcasts. Bill, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for coming on to the show. Thank you for being a part of the 10th anniversary of the Still Loading podcast. It's been quite a wild ride, so thank you for joining me.
Yeah, no problem, dude. Glad to be here.
So for those who don't know Bill and I have actually collaborated for the most part in the last 2 years, but Bill is the only person out of all of my online friends that I've made that I've actually met in person. For those who remember, last year we recorded an episode on Uncharted Golden Abyss for the PlayStation Vita, and we actually recorded that in person in my hotel room at Retro World Expo. We just strangers meeting for the first time, and I'm like, Bill, come into my hotel room. I'm not creepy at all.
Well, that's all right. You got right in my truck, so
that's true. That's true. I just walked right in. I'm like, it's fucking fine. I got a taser. I'm just kidding. I didn't have a taser. But yeah, no. So I wanted to have you on for this. So yeah, thank you again for joining me, and we're gonna dive right into this. The question I've been asking all my podcasting pals, so I'm going to also ask you: how did you first get into podcasts in general? Not how did you start your show, but when did you first start listening to podcasts, and what do you like? How did you kind of get into them in the first place?
So when I got into podcasts was probably around, I want to say 2017-ish. I kind of was fed up with the YouTube scene, and everything just got super depressing. There was a lot of doom scrolling going on at the time. Yeah. And I kind of was I need to find something new. This isn't working anymore. So I finally downloaded Spotify, and I got the Apple Podcast app up. And I kind of was just searching gaming podcasts. And at the time, it was actually kind of hard to find gaming podcasts, specific ones, because the search feature wasn't the greatest at the time.
Yeah.
But I kind of I found a few here and there that I had interest in. I also listened to a lot of sports podcasts at the time, and some history ones. But other than that, it was kind of around then. And I kind of just gradually I listen to more podcasts than anything now that I think about it.
Same. I listen to pretty much them all. I pretty much listen to podcasts all day long at work, whether it's our friends' shows, whether it's some of my favorites like Comedy Bang Bang. Always take a moment to shout out Comedy Bang Bang, which actually at the time we're recording this, it's kind of putting a time and date on our, well, not a time and date, but at least a time span that we're recording this, it was the 15th anniversary of Comedy Bang Bang, and their episode just came out, which was fantastic. Anyway,
Nice.
God, I love that show. Anyway, okay, so you started listening to podcasts because you got sick of YouTube. What were some of the first ones that you remember listening to?
So the first few I listened to, so one of the few YouTubers that I was still like following at the time was Charlie White, Moist Critical Penguins, whatever his name is these days. And I found that he has the official podcast with him and his friends. I listened to that pretty regularly. Like that's one of my more regular ones. I also I was big into like Rooster Teeth and like all the Screen Wave stuff, so I was listening to some of those. I got really into Black Box Down, which is kind of morbid because it's a podcast all about plane crashes, but it's really fascinating. It is fascinating stuff, stories and whatnot. Ironically, it actually makes me feel safer flying because it shows how much like airline safety has evolved over the years. And then I have my handful of like NASCAR podcasts and like F1, Formula One stuff that I listen to.
Okay. Yeah, see, it's interesting. I never thought there would be a whole podcast dedicated to like airplane crashes. I don't mean that as like a joke, like as an insult either. Like, you know, people listen to true crime. There's not that much of a difference between the two. So that's actually kind of interesting. That's wild. I did not know that. Now, transitioning over to more of the stuff that you make, you have 3 shows, like I mentioned before. You have the Gaming and Collecting Podcast, the 3DO Experience, as well as Geek Addicts. And I want to ask you, what made you start your respective shows? Obviously, Gaming and Collecting is the flagship show in the network you've started, the Gaming and Collecting Podcast Network. So what inspired you to start all these?
So honestly, the real inspiration was, so before I got into podcasting, I was very big on Instagram. I was like an Instagram blogger. I still am, but unfortunately the algorithm has kind of killed little like independent collectors.
You, Zuckerberg.
Yeah, kind of. Unfortunately, the Instagram scene isn't as big as it used to be, and at the time, though, I was pretty big there. I had a large amount of follow. Well, I still do, but I had a lot of interactions and stuff, and I was like averaging like 500 likes per post, which was just insane to me at the time. But I remember out of the blue one day, I got a DM from this man I didn't know named Kate Call, and his response,
a man we both know now.
Yes, and he had basically just asked like, "Hey, I really dig your collection. Do you want to be on my podcast?" And I had followed his show because he had followed me, and I had checked out a few episodes, and I liked his show for the most part. I didn't regularly listen to it, but I was a fan, I'd say. So when he asked me to be on it, I was like, sure. And I responded back, and he didn't get back to me for like 2 weeks. But which I've learned is that's just Cade. You just get used to it after a while. But yeah, so we did the episode, and I love listening back on it, but I still cringe because I use this really awful like headset mic, and like you can hear every time like my lips like flap together. It's like it's really distracting. It was also like peak COVID, so it was like just like one of those. It was a really interesting look back at the time. But we did that episode, and I kind of after it got released, I kind of got like the itch to like do more of that. And my sister Alex, who's my co-host on Gaming and Collecting, she was like pushing me really hard to like do the podcast because she it wasn't a great time for anybody at that point in time, and like we weren't getting out, we really weren't interacting with people, and I thought it'd be a good way to like kind of get my voice out there and like interact with people in a sense.
Yeah.
So I finally got into it, and I was like, okay, fine, I'm gonna make the podcast. So the first thing I did was I went on Instagram and made an Instagram page for it. And my favorite thing was I was going through all the potential names, basically just checking to see if they were already taken. And somehow I ended up settling on Gaming and Collecting because at the time I really wanted to like focus on gaming and collecting because I still am a huge collector, but I was a really big collector at the time. And Alex had jokingly said that she'd be my co-host, and I was just kind of was like, sure, let's do that. Let's see how it goes. So we ended up setting up I set up the Anchor account, and immediately I was like, I have no idea how to make a podcast. And we kind of just wung it from there. Our first few episodes are very funny because we were trying really hard to be serious, and then we quickly devolved into the nonsense that we are now, where Alex is just unhinged 24/7, and I play like the straight man of the group. We also
except when I join you, then I join Alex in the chaos.
To be fair, the Stardew Valley episode is still one of my favorite episodes we've ever done.
Well, thank you. That's one of my favorite guest spots I've ever been a part of. So thank you once again for having me on. But anyway, sorry, continue.
No worries. So we had done the first few episodes, and we eventually kind of found our voice. Like I think the peak for us was when we did the episode talking about like PS1 games from like our childhood. And that kind of is how we kind of figured out our whole repertoire of like, we'd be more of a nostalgia podcast where we talked about gaming from back when we were kids. And then we also spread into like the anime part of it, because Alex is a huge anime fan, and I've since become a pretty big anime fan going through this podcast. And now we kind of split our time half and half between gaming and anime stuff. We started doing guest spots, and like, it's just evolved into this huge thing where we're actually going to be hitting 200 episodes this year, which is insane to me.
That's bonkers, because I remember when you started it too. And a quick like kind of side question, or like expanding question. You already mentioned how like it took a little while for you guys to find your show's voice. And that's one of my questions is like about finding your show's voice. Like, what would you say is the biggest factor in finding your show's unique voice? Like, what was it that kind of made it start clicking? Or maybe what was it about the PS1 episode, if you want to talk about that specifically, or if there's something else that helped you find your show's unique voice?
So for us in particular, I think the moment that really clicked for us was we stopped trying to be super serious and like trying to be professional, and we just kind of legitimately made it, let's just be brother and sister talking about growing up and talking about like what we played in the past, and like, we're not going to try and fake this anymore, let's just be ourselves. And from there on, we weren't like, they were just real conversations, and like we could build off of that. Like, we have our own little inside jokes that we mention to each other from the past that no one really gets, but we find them funny.
The ingredients to a bottle of water.
So that's a new running one that I don't like, but she does.
Sorry, I had no idea that you did. It was just the delivery. That's a new one that I don't like. Oh my God, that got me. Sorry, continue.
No worries. Yeah, but it's kind of expanded too into like our guest spots, where you've learned in particular. But one of my favorite episode of the show that we've ever done, just because of how perfect it ended up being, and also the fact that it was just a complete last minute thing I threw together, was we did an episode last year called The Great Controller Debate, which was literally an entire episode where we talked about video game controllers and just debated them amongst ourselves. And it ended up being, it was me and Alex, Chris Copeland, friend of the show, another friend of the show, Rick Firestone from Pixel Project Radio, and Slade from the Game Club. And it turned into absolute chaos so fast, mostly because of Alex, but Chris played into it. Slade played into it. Poor Rick was trying to hold everything together in the background. It was great. That's one of my favorite moments. And that episode legit showed me like, this is just what we are. And that's how I want the show to go forward, like always.
I really think that's like an understated part of podcasting, is like realizing that how can I put it? It's not necessarily being completely yourself on mic, but realizing how you want to be, like how you feel most comfortable on mic is like where people find their show's unique voice. Like I don't think I've really noticed it. I don't even know what order these interviews are going to be put into the show just yet. So this could be one of the first interviews. It could be one of the last, but in the interviews that I have done so far, it feels like it's kind of similar to everyone. Everyone's answer is kind of, you can kind of boil it down to this, where it's like just learning how to be yourself on mic is when you find your show's unique voice. And it seems like what you and Alex have done, whether it was on the PS1 episode or the controller debate, which I listened to, by the way, it is a fantastic episode. Really enjoyed that one a ton. It's whenever you can be yourself is when you find your show's unique voice. Before we move on to our final couple of questions, I wanted to ask you about the 3DO experience and Geek Addicts, just real quickly, since I know those aren't your flagship show, but we should at least touch on them. You know, they're two of your other podcasts. So how did those shows get started, and how did you kind of end up finding your voice for each of them?
So 3DO, the 3DO experience, that is actually that show is purely an indulgent passion project of myself, because I am one of the biggest 3DO fans, I guess, in this podcasting circle. So the genesis of the 3DO experience was me and Alex had done a GNC episode covering the 3DO, and I had called it the 3DO experience, and I had wanted to. So I was heavily inspired by another podcast called Remember 64, which is a N64 based podcast hosted by another wonderful podcaster named Dave.
Dave Petrangelo. Shout out to Dave.
Wonderful man. And I basically, I loved his idea of basically just going through the N64's library and just covering all these games, because it's a system he was super nostalgic for. And I thought about what would be a cool system to do that I have a particular fondness for, and it ended up being the 3DO, because I just have a weird fascination with that system. So I set it up, and I did a few episodes, including one that Josh guested on, where we just talked about what the 3DO company was. And I kind of ran into a brick wall of sorts, where I wasn't really. It was really hard to line up guests because nobody really knows what the 3DO is, and people were always like, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know how I could join this conversation and be meaningful about it. So I hit like a bit of a wall there, and the show went on hiatus for about a year. And then I met Thrak, who was my co-host for that show. He kind of invited himself on as the co-host. And at the time I was like, I didn't really know him that well. So we did actually 2 GNC episodes covering the Sonic series, just to kind of as like a warm up. And after the second one, I was kind of like, yeah, this could work. We have a decent repertoire. So since then, we've kind of reformatted the show now, where it's basically we'll cover either a game or a topic based around 3DO for the episode, give our thoughts, like whether we think it's a must play, stay away, okay kind of game. We're going to be branching out into some post 3DO console games pretty soon, but it's been fun just kind of sharing the history of that console, because I really feel like it's a system that people need to know about, just because it is a very fascinating point in the history of gaming.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why when you started it, I was like, I want to be on this show, even though I know next to nothing about the 3DO, because it's like, I think the more obscure the system, the more interesting it is. And so I was happy that you started it.
Yeah, it's just been fun to kind of highlight all these games. Like it's actually been really fun to play a lot of them fully and be like, wow, this game is terrible. Like it's just it surprises you, but then you'll run into one that you're like, this is really cool. Like we played a game called Icebreaker, which is a puzzle strategy game where you play as a white pyramid on its side, and you just you ram into other pyramids and break them, and it is like the most. It's a game that you could see on mobile phones these days, but it's really unique for the time, and it was surprisingly fun. That was a big hidden gem, and just all sorts of stuff like that. Like we covered the infamous plumbers don't wear ties. Like we dug really deep into that game, just all sorts of stuff.
That's awesome. I love that obscure stuff, man. Now, real quick, Geek Addicts.
Geek Addicts is a bit of a more sentimental podcast. Essentially, when I had to switch jobs due to circumstances, and I ended up having to move to a different state, and I ended up leaving behind a bunch of my IRL friends, and one of them is a very close friend of mine named Matt, and we chat all the time. But like, I was like, I really want like a more like concrete way we can just talk about stuff. So I kind of threw the idea to him, like, hey, do you want to just do like a podcast on the side, like just something we can just chat every week and just keep in touch? So Geek Addicts kind of was born out of that. And the best way to describe Geek Addicts is it's literally just two friends getting together every week on like a chat call and just shooting the shit about whatever. It is a completely unedited show. Like, we basically hit record and just go. And it is essentially like, we'll pick a topic and we'll just have a normal conversation about it from there on in. And then next week we'll move on to something else. And it is a strictly pop culture show. So it is literally like anything that comes to mind, like gaming, anime, comics, TV, music. It's very much just two friends chatting for an hour every week.
If you ever need any guests on to talk James Bond, you let me know.
I will do. I actually don't know if Matt watches those, so I should probably ask him that, honestly.
Well, I will force all of you to watch all of the Bond movies. I'm just kidding. But all right, the last question I have for you, my friend, is plans for the future and, of course, plugs. I mean, we've already talked about all three of your shows, but essentially plans for the future for your shows and where everyone can find you online.
I'm sure. So plans for the future, as of right now, it's pretty much all set in stone. We're going to continue on with all three shows weekly. God help me. We're coming up to the 200th episode of GNC pretty soon, so I'm hoping to do something special for that one. I'm not exactly sure yet. That's still probably a couple months away, but more on that in the future. As for 3DO, we're very closely approaching our 50th episode, and we're going to be actually ranking all of the games that we've played on the show so far, which is going to be very interesting, especially because we're about to start jumping into post 3DO console games, including the infamous Army Men series, which that's going to be that's a rabbit hole that you wouldn't expect to be as deep as it is. And then for Geek Addicts, pretty much same stuff. Me and Matt are going to continue on with our series. We're going to be covering the Pokemon Adventures manga again pretty soon. And we'll continue on with our normal chats. And as for where you can find all of these shows, you can find all of our links at Linktree/The Barber Who Games. And we're also now on YouTube at the GNC Podcast Network. You can find all of our podcasts in audio, along with video versions for all of 3DO and Geek Addicts, and occasionally GNC. Alex doesn't like to be on camera all the time, so you're not going to see a lot of Alex over there. But yeah, other than that, that's pretty much where you can find us.
All right, everyone, make sure to go check out all of Bill's stuff. It's all wonderful content. Please go check it out. Bill, thank you for joining me.
No problem, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
Joining now is one of the co-hosts of the Retro Hangover podcast. I am joined by Chris Copleen, one of the two hosts, and actually, I guess kind of a trio that you have with your editor, Ashton, but one of the people over at the Retro Hangover podcast. Chris, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on this, and congratulations on 10 years.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to chatting with you. And what I've been doing through all these is just kind of asking everyone about how they got into podcasting and like their show, just a little bit about the stuff that they do. So my first question for you, Chris, is how did you first get into podcasts in general? Not doing a podcast, but just like listening, discovering them. Like, how did you first kind of get into the podcasts in general?
Oh, I don't remember specifically because it was a while ago. So you've been around 10 years. Retro Hangover will be around 10 years next year. And a lot of the inspiration for starting a podcast was because you listen to other podcasts. So, go back 10 years. That's a long time to think about specifics and what really gets you into it. But I think there were two podcasts that I really honed in on. One was, of course, Retronauts, which I know you
Mhm.
love. The other one I think was more inspirational to me, and I definitely listened to it more often back then, and which is unfortunate because I don't listen to it as often now. I don't even know if they're really still going, but it was the Completely Unnecessary podcast with Pat Contry and Ian Ferguson,
Okay,
which, yeah,
that has more recently become one of my favorites. They are now doing kind of like a monthly show. They're no longer weekly. They just kind of do monthly shows now.
right, right. But I used to listen to them all the time. I would listen to them when I was mowing my lawn, mostly because Pat's a pretty famous retro collector. He
Hmm.
makes it up. He has made it an entire point, almost a career out of telling everybody that he has the complete NES library. So it's like
You know,
I am gravitated towards this podcast because they're talking collecting, they're talking NES games, they're talking retro games, and that's when I was really getting started on kind of my retro collecting journey as well. So having that outlet there was really nice, and of course, other podcasts would come and go. I think I listened to the IGN podcast every once in a while. I listened to the Jimquisition podcast quite a bit as well. I listened to that quite a bit, a ton. I wouldn't call that really an inspiration. It was just something that I really appreciated listening to.
hmm
So that's when I really started listening to the podcast. That was the big three for me. It was the Completely Unnecessary podcast, Jimquisition podcast, and Retronauts.
That's at a very, I mean, it's all gaming related, but like Retronauts and the CU podcast makes sense. I've never listened to the Jimquisition podcast. I don't know, because I think it's Stephanie now, right? I think that's
James Stephanie Sterling.
James Stephanie Sterling. I just want to make sure I'm saying their name correctly. I don't know if they even still host it. Is that even still active anymore?
It's still active. I haven't listened to it in a very long time just because, well, I haven't listened to more mainstream podcasts just because I've been listening to the podcasts in our circle, which are very much more indie.
Mhm.
And that's really the reason. It's just the mainstream podcasts for me, the more popular ones have just kind of fallen off the wayside.
I getcha. I getcha. Now, transitioning over, what made you start your show? I know I've heard it on other podcasts, but I don't think any of my listeners have heard the inspiration for how Retro Hangover started, how you and Shane kind of connected and started and became the dynamic duo. And then when Ashton
Mhm.
came on, because I think I see it in your bio. You now credit Ashton as it's a trio for Retro Hangover now.
I definitely consider it a trio just because Ashton is that instrumental in getting that show across the finish line. He is our editor. So if you think our show is high production quality, has a professional level of polish to it, that's all Ashton. And he has done a phenomenal job for us as soon as he took over editing. And I couldn't thank him enough. I think, he's done a great job in really improving the quality of our show and making it easier for me and Shane. But in terms of how the show got started, it goes back to probably 2014, maybe even 2013. I'm going to say 14. And it started, we would go to this event, I guess, once a month. I think it was called Arcade Jacks. I don't remember if that's what it was called. That may have been a separate event that was loosely connected, but it was actually hosted by our Nintendo host, Tiger. And
Mm.
he would throw these big parties. It was in a bar on Bay Street here in Jacksonville, Florida, and it was called Dive Bar. Now, since then, Dive Bar has closed down. It's been replaced. I don't know by what, but we would go there once a month, and they would have video game themed drinks. They would have arcade cabinets set up. They would have retro consoles, hooked up all around the floor, and including modern consoles like there'd be a Wii U. There'd be like an Xbox 360, and everyone would just kind of hang out and have a good time. And there were a lot of people that were all like nerds and just old retro gamers. And we all go out
Yeah.
over there and we'd hang out and we'd have a great time. And I don't know if I met Shane there or if I met him at our local video game store, Video Game Rescue. And because Video Game Rescue had opened up in 2014. And he was there a lot. They had a lot of events at Video Game Rescue. I know Shane knew the owner pretty well. I had gotten to know the owner pretty well. And so we met through the owner and we went to all these events. So eventually we just ended up hanging out a lot at these events, developing a friendship, and, everything was good. And eventually we started hanging out outside these parties. And one of the places we hung out at was a place called Brewers, which also unfortunately has shut down. So if me and Shane frequent your place, on a long enough
The Retro
timeline, I guess you're
Hangover
doomed.
curse.
I guess so. but it was called Brewers, and it was a brewery, and on top of being a pizzeria, and we would go over there because I was big into craft beer. Shane was big into craft beer at the time, and that's where we'd frequent, get our snob beer culture going on. And one day we were talking about video games, as we are wont to do, and all of a sudden this dude at the counter that was next to us was like, I don't even know what the hell you all are talking about, but I was really interested in what you were saying. You guys like get deep into this conversation. And like, I kind of looked at Shane, and after a while I was like, we should do a podcast. He's like, do you think so? I'm like, yeah. He's like, do you know how to do a podcast? I'm like, absolutely no idea. He's like, okay. And so I was like, I always was thinking about doing it because when I was listening to like the Completely Unnecessary podcast, I tried getting a podcast with another friend of mine from like when I was a kid, because I thought he'd be interested in it. And that just didn't work out because I don't think either of us were really serious about it. But I just planted that seed, and all of a sudden Shane, I guess, got really into it and got really more aggressive about it and was like, hey, you want to do a podcast? I got like a mic. I looked up editing software. I did all these things. I'm like, yeah, sure. So we went over to his place, and he had this table, and we went to his like office room, and we just put the mic in the middle of the table. We hooked it up to a laptop, and we just hit record. And if you listen to the very first couple of episodes, there's a lot of the CU podcast influence because we're going over the news of the day. And then how we wanted to differentiate ourselves from other podcasts is we'd have a central topic in addition to the news, which I don't know if that was common back then, but it felt like that wasn't happening. You either had news shows that were covering like the news of the day, or you had people that were covering topics, but you didn't have people that were doing both. I'm like, okay, we're going to do that. Yeah. And that's kind of where it got started. And the first episode launched in May of 2015.
That's kind of wild. I liked how when you were referencing the thing with your Nintendo host, Tiger, that, it was, retro modern, and you mentioned the Wii U. I'm like, yep, that was 10 years ago. That's a very 10-year-old. That is a very 10 years ago modern system. That's I don't know, that just amused me. You alluded to one of my next questions though. What was one of the biggest factors in helping you and Shane find your show's unique voice? And I feel like, as with there's very few indie podcasts that start out pretty fully formed. I feel like I think your show and my show are kind of unique in the fact that we've been doing this for quite some time. So where some of the other podcasts that are in our circle, it feels like I don't mean this as an insult at all, but like Dave from Tales from the Backlog, his show came out pretty fully formed, like right from the get-go. Like he knew what he wanted with his show, and he got it. And I feel like based off what you were saying, because you did the news in the beginning, mine was always kind of like a topic show in the start, but it took a little while to find my own voice. And what is my voice now? I barely even know. But so I'm going to try to ask that tough question over to you now, Chris. What was the factor in helping you and Shane find what you wanted to do with Retro Hangover?
I guess 2 years of being on hiatus would be the first step, because when we started recording in 2015, first of all, the first speed hump is that I got a promotion later that year in September or so, and that promotion within my job took me out of commission for essentially 6 weeks or so. And once that was over, my schedule kind of changed up a little bit. We weren't as able to record as we normally had been. So I think if you look at our schedule, you'll see an episode, and then you'll see another episode like 6 weeks later, and then it's done. And one of the reasons is because I left for overseas in early 2016, and I didn't come back until like June of 2018. I mean, I've been around visiting and so on and so forth, like stopping by, for a week or two or a month, and then I go back. But, that's not with any sort of, periodicity or reliability of being available to record a podcast, especially like on a big gray floaty thing in the middle of the Middle East for 8 straight months. You're not going to be able to record anything. And then like in the middle of nowhere in the Indian Ocean, where you have to spend $150 a month for 8 gigabytes of data, you also are never recording anything, let alone even considering to get internet. It's just not worth it. So yeah, my my availability was extremely limited. We had discussed continuing the show during that time, and maybe Shane would take over, but I guess that didn't happen, and the show just kind of died for 2 years. And I actually thought that it was going to be dead, like it was never going to be revived. So I come back in about May or June timeframe of 2018, and I'm hanging out with Shane, reconnecting, being like, I'm glad I'm back. And, once again, we're at a restaurant, drinking some brews. It's also a pizzeria called Mellow Mushroom. It's a chain. I don't know if you have them up there. But Shane looked at me. He's like, hey, do you want to do it again? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, I love doing a podcast, but like, I don't have any of the technical know-how. I don't know how useful I'd be. He's like, I really want to do it. I really want to get into it. I'm like, okay, I'm on board. So during that time, we reviewed what we did before, and we were like, you know what? We really don't want to do this. And this was more Shane's idea. Like, we need to find a way to be unique ourselves.
Mhm.
So maybe we could get like a brief history and before we get into the topic, but we don't really need to do the news, but like, let's get out of that. I think Shane, at the time he may have referenced the Giant Bombcast, but I'm not sure. You'd have to ask him. But that's where he kind of got his idea from. And I really hadn't been listening to podcasts that much because, of course, no internet. So
Yep.
like, I was willing to do whatever. And that's kind of where we started finding our voice, was there. So if you go back, I think the first episode that we recorded when I came back was the PlayStation episode. And that in essence is our formula today. We've made some tweaks and peaks there. We've definitely, structured it better, because it didn't used to have structure. We just used to have this free flowing conversation about what the game was. And now we've segmented and broken it down in terms of more of a review structure. Like, now we talk about like our personal experiences, what we think of the story, the gameplay, and the audio and visual aspects of the game. But before, we didn't even do that. We just went straight into talking about the game. So that structure has changed. But in terms of finding our voice, as soon as I came back, Shane had this really good idea for how to structure the show, and it's kind of been that way ever since. And when you grow and mature as a podcast, and you start, getting a rhythm for what it is, we have gotten better. I don't know what the quality is in terms of our listenership, or what the greater population thinks of the show, but I do think that we've really refined it and made the product much better quality than what it was. But it's essentially the same thing since then.
Well, I can't say if it's improved or not. I can just tell you I really enjoy the product as it is right now, because I didn't listen to a lot of the older episodes of Retro Hangover, but I can tell you of what I have listened to since we've been collaborating. I mean, God, it's been over at least like the last 2 years or so now.
More than that.
I guess so. I think because because I came on in 2021, I think
I think so.
I think so, yeah, because it was the Medal of Honor Allied Assault episode. Oh my God, it's been over 3 years. Holy shit. Yeah, it's been 3 years, and I can tell you I love the show. I love what you guys do with it. So my final question for you before we go into plugs is plans for the future. Like, what do you and Shane have in store? I know you guys plan out your episodes well in advance, but are there any other projects that you have in store, or is there anything you want to kind of shout out before the plugs?
In terms of the future, we're just going to keep trucking along. You can expect more King of Games if you're a fan of that. I do like that project. I want to continue to do that for as long as we can. I think we have a really good group.
And actually, real quick, for my listeners who don't know what King of Games is, Chris, tell them, what is the King of Games?
Oh, the King of Games is we take a year and we select 20 games. That's the number right now. I don't think we're going to go beyond 20. It's tempting, but I think we'll stick at 20. And we put them into tournament format. And, we have a bunch of episodes where we have a bunch of our podcasting friends, and we put 2 games together, and then they vote which game goes forward in order to determine what the King of Games in said year is. And this goes back to Region Free Gamers, and they started it with 1998, and they did it on their own. And I liked their product so much. I'm like, hey, let's do a collab. Let's do another King of Games. And the biggest reason they didn't do another one was the amount of editing work and labor that went into it, which I completely understand. So I was like, let's split this up. I can do half the editing, and we'll have half the shows on our feed and half the shows on your feed. And all the shows will be both on our Patreon, but that way it gets people to listen to both shows. And then you only have to do half the work, and we'll do the other half. So I took lead on editing for that because I'd learned how to edit since 2018. I've learned how to do a lot since then. And like that worked out for 2000. And then we went into 1992. And by that time, Region Free Gamers had disbanded. They became defunct, unfortunately. And we kept Arnie and Ozzy from that group to do King of Games 92. And then Arnie left. And now we have the King of Games 96, which Ozzy is also a part of. But now this is a completely different group of people. And I feel very honored to have these people to join us, one of which is you. And thank you very much for being part of that. But just to know that we have this community and such great people being a part of it, and, you know, kind of forming this friendship bond with all these people across the internet to create this product. I'm very proud of it. I've worked very, very hard in it. I also know everyone in there has as well, and especially in contributing their time and efforts into doing this. So the King of Games is that product, that show is something I love and I love to promote, and I hope a lot of people check that out because of how much time and effort goes into it, just as much as our show, you know. Like, I don't want it to overshadow the show itself, but yeah, I mean, this is such a collaborative effort. I gotta hype it up.
I thank you for including me, and I'm honored to have been in the last the last two, the last two, because I believe at the time this episode comes out, the King of Games 96 will be releasing on the free feed. It will be away out of your Patreon wall. I don't know which episode will be coming out. This is coming out, I want to say in July. So who knows where the King of Games will be then. You'll have to, so listeners, if you're interested in that, please consider going over to the Retro Hangover feed. They will be you can see how the tournament has been progressing over there. I was on a few episodes of that, and yeah, man, I love the King of Games as well. It's one of my favorite. One thing that I've been really enjoying, that I've been seeing a lot of people in our like podcasting friend group and circle and our peers do, is that you have your primary thing, right? You know, you do you have your shows standard format, and then you have all these different things that you kind of do a little bit different. Like King of Games for you guys is like your big extracurricular project, kind of. It's still all tied together, but it's this cool project that it's awesome. I love that they kind of complement each other. So King of Games is great, is what I'm trying to say.
And thank you so much for being part of that. You know, a lot of people say thank you for allowing me to be part of that, and you know, I really turn it back on them, because like, this is something, like, me and Shane cannot do this by ourselves. Like, that's not going to happen. Me and him, like, there's two of us. We definitely need other people to do this. And this is why I think, such a special project, because collaborations like this, I don't see too often. And I'm happy everyone has agreed to be part of it, and everyone's so flexible. So it really does make me happy to see what it's become.
Well, and that's why I'm doing I mean, it is my honor, is my privilege. I love doing it, man. So thank you for having me. But like, that's the reason I'm doing these like little interviews for the 10th anniversary, because I kind of a similar thing to what you just said. Like, these are all the 10 people I have on here by no means, and I've already said this in the intro, which has yet to be recorded, but by no means are they the only people who have helped me make the show what it is. But these are 10 people I interact with the most and have helped me the most. And it's not to say, I shouldn't say the most, but like the 10 people that like I've interacted with the most by far, for sure, and have helped me make the show what it is. And like you said, you and Shane couldn't do King of Games by yourself. I couldn't do this show by myself. I need guests every episode. So I figured, what better way to celebrate 10 years of the podcast than to highlight some of the guests who have helped make my show what it is. And you are definitely one of them. So thank you for being a part of the show, and even not on the mic. Even I try to not gush too much about the guest, just because I know it can make people uncomfortable. Not everyone likes to receive compliments, but like you listen to me bounce off ideas off you all the time. Like, hey, what do you think of this idea? What do you think of that? Or like, have you, like, if I'm thinking about getting a guest on that I've never interacted with, I check sometimes with you. Have you ever interacted with this person? Do you have any insight to like if they would be a good fit for the show type of thing? Or even just like what I mean, at the time this comes out, our episode will have been released, the Grand Soul Story episode, where I'm like, hey, I got a review code for an unknown RPG. Would you be interested in playing it and reviewing it with me for the show? And you were gracious enough to set aside, I mean, it's not like a crazy long game, but it was like a 20-hour RPG, 20 to 30-hour RPG that you set aside some time for. So thank you for that.
No, and thank you for including me on all that. And I really do appreciate it. A lot of the same things that you said, I'd redirect back towards you. I mean, this is what's awesome about the podcasting community. You can't do it with other people. Some people miraculously can, but I don't think that in that case the journey is necessarily worth it. I would rather have the friends I've made along the way. I know that's cheesy, but I'd rather I'd rather have that than a ton of success. And I mean, I say that, but I think I really do feel that, because I can still say I'm part of a community, and like when they grow, I grow, and when I grow, they grow. And that's kind of the overarching view of it. And that's what I love to see.
It's as cheesy as it sounds. Like, the friends we made along the way is really fucking accurate to the podcasting community. Like,
oh, absolutely,
really, really accurate. But all right, let's wrap this up, Chris. The last thing I have for you is just plugs. Where can people find Retro Hangover online, and shout it all out?
So yeah, if you want to find us, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible here. Go to linktr.ee/retro hangover. You can find all of our links there. It has links to all of our socials, our Twitch channel where we stream once a week. And that's really where I'm going to, put the plugs in, because you can find our podcast in any podcast service of your choice. Even YouTube Music, which is, it's gross, but we're there. We're definitely there. But you can find us anywhere. Just type in Retro Hangover Podcast in your Google search bar if you don't want to use the link tree. But that's where we're at, and would love to hear from you, and would love to interact with any of your listeners. Any friend of yours is a friend of ours.
Yes, everyone go check out Retro Hangover. Love what you guys do. And yeah, Chris, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Josh. And once again, happy anniversary. Happy 10th year.
Thank you. I'm going to put a pin in it right here, y'all. This is about the halfway point of everything that I have recorded and prepared for the 10th anniversary episode here. It's now a two-parter. It's a two-part extravaganza for the 10th anniversary of the Still Loading podcast. So I'm going to put a pin in this right here. If you liked what you heard and you like my show, of course, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcast or whichever podcasting app you use. It does help more people find the show, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy. And I like feeling warm and fuzzy. I'm going to not go through all my spiels, I guess, but you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram @StillLoadingPod on all of them. Blue Sky @StillLoadingPod, Threads @StillLoadingPod, Twitch @StillLoadingPod, and then of course my Patreon, patreon.com/StillLoadingPod. Lots of awesome goodies over there at various different tiers. Please go consider checking that out if you want to support the show. But yeah, that's it for part 1. Up next is part 2.